I think we have a real problem with a runaway Supreme Court. They turn the rhetoric of originalism on and off according to their ideological purposes.
The big thing, I don't think it makes a difference. So I think that the Supreme Court has ruled. Let's move on with it.
Breaking news today, the Supreme Court has struck down a Trump-era federal ban on bump stocks, limiting the power of federal agencies. The ruling ends a nationwide ban on the devices, which convert semi-automatic rifles to ones capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. The ban, implemented by then-President Trump, was in response to a 2017 mass shooting at a Las Vegas music festival that killed 58 people. Justice Clarence Thomas, who wrote the opinion, said that a gun equipped with a bump stock does not meet the definition of a machine gun under federal law. Joining me now to help make sense of this monumental ruling is The Hill's Zach Schonfeld. Zach, thank you so much for joining us today. This lawsuit was brought by a Texas-based gun store owner who challenged the ban. The lawsuit was then backed by the National Rifle Association and other advocacy groups. What exactly does this ruling mean for gun owners?
This ruling means that for gun owners who at one point might have owned a bump stock and had to surrender it when this nationwide ban was put back into effect, that ban no longer exists. This regulation that was first implemented during the Trump administration's ATF that extended and now has been defended by the Biden administration, this regulation is no more. The Supreme Court saying that the executive branch went too far here. In theory, it still leaves the door open that Congress could make an amendment to federal firearms law to explicitly ban these devices. But I think it's pretty safe to say that there's not much of an appetite among Republicans in Congress to reinstate this ban. There has been a proposal on the table, but so far only one House Republican has co-sponsored the bill. So it seems that at least for a while, that this ban is no more.
So how did the justices vote on this ruling?
This was a ruling that came down along the Supreme Court's ideological lines. We had the 6 conservatives in the majority, and then the 3 liberal justices dissenting. So the majority opinion, as you were mentioning, by Justice Clarence Thomas, someone who we've seen write about guns before he wrote the opinion in the Supreme Court's biggest expansion of Second Amendment rights, a big case they had 2 years back, along with his 5 conservative colleagues. And they were all united. The only kind of crack in it was that we actually saw Justice Alito. He wrote separately this brief opinion basically telling Congress, if they want to amend the law, they still are able to ban firearms. But other than that, it was really straight along those 6-3 ideological lines.
Well, speaking of those ideological lines, Justice Sonia Sotomayor took a rare step, reading her dissent in court. What was her response?
Yeah, it was pretty rare to see her read this dissent from the bench in court this morning. This was the first time that we have seen any of the justices do so far this term. Now, this is pretty rare, but it does happen for some of the court's biggest cases. So I think the fact that she actually not only was issuing this fiery dissent, but actually reading a summary of it aloud from the bench just shows both how important this case was, how much she disagreed with the conservative majority, and also a sign that we're getting towards the end of the Supreme Court's term here in June, where we expect to see on occasion some of these dissenters read aloud from the bench. But her opinion overall really taking aim, saying that Congress, when they implemented this law banning machine guns, saying that they intended that to cover what we now call bump stocks. So she's making pretty clear that she pretty vehemently disagrees with the majority's reasoning.
This major decision comes as the Supreme Court has been, at the top of the news cycle. It's been surrounded in controversy after the court disclosed gifts justices received, which have also raised ethics concerns. It has just been revealed that Justice Clarence Thomas failed to disclose 3 trips paid by GOP megadonor Harlan Crow. In total, Thomas has received nearly $4.2 million in gifts. Firstly, are these gifts legal, and what are lawmakers trying to do to force justices to disclose this information publicly?
So I think if these trips were to have happened now, as we're talking in present day, I think that it is a little bit more clear. And that's because as this pressure was building right before all of those ProPublica stories had come out last year about Justice Thomas, there was an update to the guidance about these kinds of gifts and whether or not the Supreme Court justices are required to report them. Justice Thomas, his attorneys, their defense is that back when these trips happened, they were not required to be disclosed because they fell under what's called the personal hospitality exception. But last year, we saw the Judiciary's advisory group had updated the guidance on it. So I think moving forward, if these trips were to occur, it's pretty clear. But I think back a few years ago when these trips happened, I think Justice Thomas's lawyers certainly think they have a defense when the guidance was a little bit more murky.
So switching gears to Hunter Biden, who was just recently convicted on several felony gun charges. He's dismissed a lawsuit he filed against former Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani and Robert Costello. What was in this lawsuit, and why did Hunter Biden now decide to drop the case?
Yeah, this is part of what has really been a legal mess surrounding Hunter Biden, not only the actual, gun case where we just saw him actually go on his first criminal trial, but Hunter Biden is involved in a number of different civil lawsuits. His lawyers have really pursued a pretty aggressive strategy in suing various people. This all goes back to that laptop that's been in the news so much over these last few years. So suddenly now dropping the civil case, one thing here in play is you got to remember is that Rudy Giuliani is in bankruptcy. So when we're talking about civil lawsuits trying to seek damages. Right now, Hunter Biden is technically one of Rudy Giuliani's creditors in his bankruptcy case. So I think, even if Hunter Biden today was able to pull out a win in this lawsuit, it still would actually be very difficult for him to collect any damages from Rudy Giuliani at the end of the day. That being said, just before we started speaking, I got a statement from one of Rudy Giuliani's advisors who certainly he's saying that they are celebrating this development and that this lawsuit is no more.
Zach Schonfeld, thank you so much for joining us, for helping us break down all of these legal stories. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Trump hit two major milestones this week, making his first appearance on Capitol Hill after the January 6th attack and turning 78 years old. The former president spent time meeting with House and Senate Republicans, rallying support for his 2024 presidential bid. And his early birthday present may have been from longtime critic, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who shook hands with Trump in a show of support. Joining me now is my very good friend and the Hill's national political reporter, Cate Martel. Cate, as always, it's good to see you. Let's jump into it. Trump's visit to Capitol Hill was certainly a reunion with Republicans in both chambers. They very much welcomed him, showing full support. What were your biggest takeaways from his time on the Hill on Thursday?
Yeah, Julie, I have two major takeaways. The first is that Trump had a lot of gripes. He went on rants about Taylor Swift, Nancy Pelosi, all of the GOP detractors that actually voted to impeach him, noting that none of them are now in office. But the second bigger takeaway, I think, is this is the most united I have seen Republicans in a long time. And ironically, what made them unified is that former President Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. And this really seemed to unite the party. As you mentioned, it brought in Senate GOP leader Mitch McConnell, also Senator Mitt Romney, who was not expected to attend. His flight was canceled, and he was able to attend. So it ended up pretty full room of both Republicans from the House and the Senate throughout the day. And it seemed like a fairly unified party going forward. That was the goal, to have a big, pep rally among Republicans to get on the same page ahead of the summer campaigning for the November election. And it seemed to, I think, overall be an effective day for Republicans.
Interesting that so many Republicans facing very uphill races in their districts and their states also appeared in the meeting with Trump. So that's certainly interesting. So on the Senate side, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who in the past blamed Trump for inciting riots on January 6th, has certainly changed his tune on the former president. He's vowed to support Trump's presidential run. How did that meeting go between the two yesterday?
I'd say it went fairly well, Julia. They put their hatchets away after more than 3 years of this feud. They've had a lot of beef that began with Trump refusing to acknowledge the results of the 2020 election. And we saw it even dip lower and lower over the past few years. Even Trump had racist remarks against McConnell's wife, the former transportation secretary, Elaine Chao. And it got fairly deeply personal, that they put their hatchets aside. And I think that they both realize that, if Trump does well on the top of the ticket, McConnell thinks that will likely trickle down to House and Senate candidates. And so, if Trump wins, they all win. So he was able to put his hatchet down and have a fairly smooth meeting with Trump. McConnell is stepping down in November as the Senate GOP leader. And as far as he's concerned, if he can leave the Senate controlled by GOP, that'll help his legacy. So it was in everyone's best interest to come together. And overall, it seemed to be a fairly smooth day, Julia.
And a major example of Republicans once again falling in line. And many of those Republicans say they're falling in line because of policy. And we know that Trump used his time to speak with his colleagues on the Hill to talk about policy issues. He called for additional tariffs, action on the southern border, and even attacked the Department of Justice. What was his messaging on these issues?
His messaging, I would say overall, is this was Trump in attack mode. He was urging his Republican colleagues to not shy away from the issues that they're advocating for on the campaign trail. He directly even spoke about abortion and told Republicans that, they shouldn't shy away and back down from what they believe on abortion, but did caution them that they should, at the very least, advocate for some exceptions and be careful about how they word things on the campaign trail. He also talked about the border, immigration, the tax cuts that he implemented during his administration and urged Republicans to extend those in 2025. This was, I think, a really big rallying message for Republicans to try to get on the same page as far as what they're going to be campaigning on. And Trump was, I think, fairly strong in what he was urging his Republican colleagues to say and was telling them basically, let's get on the same page. Don't shy away from some of these issues, even though we think they might not be politically as popular, such as abortion. A lot of polling reflects that abortion is fairly popular among a lot of voters, but telling them we need to stay on the same page and we can't back down.
One of the biggest headlines to come out of yesterday's meeting, and it's certainly a big headline in Milwaukee with the Journal Sentinel using Trump's quote on the city, and it's where Trump, called Milwaukee, which is where the RNC is holding its convention this year, a horrible city. What more did he have to say about this? What is he responding to the backlash against this? The Democratic National Committee already has billboards up in Milwaukee drawing attention to this. How is Trump defending this?
Yeah, well, Trump just handed Democrats on a silver platter something that they can use in all of the campaign ads, and I'm willing to bet that every Wisconsin voter will be inundated with that quote in campaign ads leading up to November. Trump campaign did quickly clarify that they weren't talking about the city itself. They argue they were talking about the crime rate, but I would argue this will haunt him. This is a purple state that was decided by just 21,000 votes in 2020, and Democrats are really seizing on these comments. This is, as you mentioned, where the Republican National Convention will be in July. And I think this message could really haunt Trump, but Trump is trying to defend himself by saying we weren't talking about the city, we were just talking about the crime rates.
Right. It's so interesting because Republicans were very much touting the fact that they chose Milwaukee because it's a part of that very critical swing Rust Belt region. So they find themselves in a bit of a pickle right now. We'll see how long this stays in the news cycle. So we were talking about abortion before and reproductive issues. Senate Republicans blocked legislation that would have codified into law access to in vitro fertilization nationwide. Trump used his time on the Hill to discuss abortion and reproductive rights messaging with Republicans. Cate, will we see the GOP shift their stance at all on these key issues going into the election? It seems to be an issue that Democrats are very strong on, but Republicans haven't quite found their footing on yet.
I think that's a good way of wording it, Julia, particularly because a lot of this polling, as I mentioned, does reflect broad support for women's reproductive rights. And Democrats really do want to campaign on this. So far we've seen Republicans have largely tried to avoid talking about this on the campaign trail. And in fact, Democrats have been trying to force votes to get Republicans on record for their stances for reproductive rights. But I think that as far as whether we see Republicans start shifting their stances, this is such a fiercely, deeply personal issue for both Republicans and Democrats. And while I don't expect any Republicans to alter their stances or even shift them even slightly, I think where they can have some change is with their messaging. And that's why we saw Trump emphasize that yesterday, that they might be saying, well, we're not expecting you to shift your stance on abortion, but let's frame this in a more politically popular way. And what they deem that to be as talking about exceptions for example, rape and for cases of incest, or the life of the mother. So there are small issues that they think they can tweak as far as messaging, but I don't expect Republicans to shift their stances in any way before November.
I want to turn to the horse race. Trump continues to lead in 6 battleground states. Focusing in on North Carolina, the Biden campaign is looking to use Vice President Kamala Harris as their secret weapon. What's their plan, and is there any risk in this? She has become very much a big target for Republicans in their messaging.
It is a big risky. I think it's actually pretty fascinating that Democrats are targeting North Carolina. This is a state, that hasn't voted Republican in quite some time, and they are figuring out that they think that Vice President Harris can, up her game in North Carolina. This is actually her 5th stop in the state in just this year, and what the Biden campaign is realizing is they think that they can turn the state blue in the presidential race because she's speaking to a demographic that Biden has been, fairly weak on, and that's Black communities, specifically Black male voters. And that's who Harris has been speaking to. And they're making the bet that they're going to have a big investment in North Carolina. They think that they can flip it and have it go in Biden's direction. But it also is, again, a bit risky just because, we so far have been seeing that Trump has been doing well in the state of North Carolina, and it is still an upward battle for Democrats to take that state.
Yeah, Maryland Governor Wes Moore campaigning the state earlier this week. He has been a pivotal asset to messaging to the Black community. So yet another example of that with the vice president. I want to go overseas now. World leaders have gathered in Italy for this year's G7 summit. President Biden signed a new security agreement with Ukraine, laying a path for long-term support for Kyiv. What's inside the deal, and what additional funding did world leaders approve for Ukraine?
So the biggest part of this deal is a $50 billion loan to Ukraine so that they can buy weapons and they can invest in critical infrastructure that had been destroyed during the war, because this is a key time for Russia on the battlefield, and they want to rebuild some of this infrastructure. Now, the interesting part is how this loan will be repaid. It's actually coming from interest from frozen Russian assets. So this is going to be $50 billion going to Ukraine, as well as you mentioned, the 10-year security agreement that President Biden and Ukrainian President Zelensky actually signed yesterday. So far that basically we're seeing that Biden wants to reaffirm the support for Ukraine. We saw over the past few months aid to Ukraine had been held up in Congress. It did end up passing, but even just last week, Biden apologized to Zelensky for the delay and blamed his Republican colleagues on the Hill for the delay. And this was, I think, a major effort for world leaders to reaffirm the support for Ukraine, because they realized just how important this is globally, that Ukraine is successful in this war.
Back here in the U.S., Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, who is overseeing Trump's Georgia election interference case, hit back at critics who have attacked her over a relationship she had with prosecutor Nathan Wade. Cate, what's her reaction been to the critics? I know there's been some recent comments she's made.
Yeah, she actually delivered remarks yesterday and addressed this, Julia. And she said that she's repeatedly being attacked and over-sexualized, and she tried to defend herself as best she could by saying that, this is what it is like to be a Black woman in America, that she is being the subject of some of these attacks that are pointed at her. She even pointed to, as her name is Fani, and Republicans have occasionally been calling her Fani to try to humiliate her, and she equated this to schoolboy actions and said that she's being repeatedly embarrassed. So she's trying to stick up for herself, but by making these remarks, this is the most that I've seen her try to come out and publicly defend herself by saying that some of these attacks are just pointed at her specifically. Now, she has somewhat derailed the case because of a relationship that she had with a special prosecutor. That special prosecutor is now off the case, but there still are efforts to disqualify her from the case and being a part of it. So far unsuccessful, but I think we've really seen that she is trying to defend herself, and some of these attacks have gotten deeply personal against her.
Yeah, this case was obviously a case that former President Trump, was the subject of, but she's become really a center of this case, in terms of speculation and coverage. So we'll be watching that. Want to end on a lighter note. Over at the Vatican, Pope Francis had a star-studded greeting from a number of famous comedians. Why were so many celebrities over there?
I'm so glad you asked about this. This has been my favorite story of the morning. The Pope actually invited more than 100 comedians from around the world, a lot of Hollywood celebrities, to meet with him to discuss their humor and to thank them for uniting the world. He argued that that's the way that we come together. Some of these celebrities that were there: Whoopi Goldberg, Stephen Colbert, Conan O'Brien, Jimmy Fallon, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Chris Rock. It's an incredible crew. And what I keep thinking, and I wrote in my 12:30 Report newsletter this morning, is that can you imagine being in the room with just the Pope? Or can you imagine being in the room with just one of these comedians? Not to mention all of them together. I think I would have been pretty starstruck.
Yeah, my biggest question is, did any of them make the Pope laugh? He seems like a pretty easygoing person, so I wouldn't be surprised, but what a gathering. Cate Martel, thank you so much for joining me. And for our viewers, be sure to subscribe to her 12:30 Report. You get it Monday through Friday in your inbox. I get it. It's a great midday briefing, so highly recommend it. Thanks, Cate.
Thanks as always.
The U.S. military will soon dismantle the pier constructed off the Gaza coast amid concerns that it might again be damaged. That's according to a CNN report. The pier was completed late last month as a way to get humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. Just days after it was completed, it was detached from the shore by high winds and rough seas. It reopened earlier this month. Now, more rough seas have led to officials to halt operations and move the pier back into the port Friday night as a preemptive safety measure. It's not clear when operations would resume. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a formal apology to Catholic Native Americans communities Friday for the trauma many Indigenous people experienced at Catholic boarding schools. The conference acknowledged that, quote, the church played a part in traumas experienced by Native American communities and drafted a framework to refocus their efforts in those communities. The conference said the document was created with input from Native Catholics and is not meant to be a one-size-fits-all solution. They say the framework should be guidance on how local parishes can address and help heal Indigenous Catholic communities. Boeing continues to remain in the limelight with concerns over the safety of their planes. The Federal Aviation Administration is investigating an incident when a Southwest Boeing 737 MAX fell into a Dutch roll in late May. A Dutch roll, for those unfamiliar, is when a tail slide and roll motion occurs at the same time. The motion can be difficult to control and recover from. The FAA believes the roll could have been due to a damaged backup power unit. In March, the administration conducted an audit of Boeing and found numerous instances when the aerospace company failed to comply with manufacturing quality control requirements. Federal regulators are also investigating how titanium parts with falsified records wound up in Boeing and Airbus passenger jets. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.